Yeah, want to get to the incentives part, because I think that is something that we all agree would be helpful. Rachel, I want to challenge you, because I've known you a long time, so I can do that. We all understand the difficulties of getting new legislation and authority for FDA, but I believe that through more coordination, and you may have this in your back pocket already, within FDA, we could drive and provide more incentives. And for example, you mentioned in this session, if we're getting pushback from, if companies are getting pushback from divisions, let you know about it. So why do we have to have that situation? Couldn't the agency pull their people together and say, we are going to, for every new drug application, make sure there's a real world evidence generation plan, something like that. You don't have to respond. I'm just putting that out as a potential incentive.
Yes. How many employees does Amgen have? Just out of curiosity, probably. Well, anyway.
19,000.
19?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
FDA with contractors is somewhere between 20 and 24, I forget which. So that point was driven home to me once when I was complaining to someone from industry about something someone in their organization had done, and they said to me, well, is everyone at FDA perfect? Or gives a perfect answer. So the answer is we're doing that. The answer is you're going to see an awful lot of writing over the next few months on exactly this topic. Right. And to the extent that we are focusing on internal education as well as external education. So I would make that one point. The second point I would make is that not every question will be answered in the real world setting. Right? Some, but many perhaps could be. We have an epidemic of lack of evidence. Mm-hmm. And no, we do. And we, as physicians, people who provide care, too often we are guessing or talking about how long should you dialyze someone, and we don't know. Right. When the HIV epidemic hit, everyone was mobilized. So the first application that had HIV RNA in it was in 93. The surrogate was validated by 97. Mm-hmm. All the companies came together, everyone contributed their data. So we have another epidemic, it's a much quieter one, it's less noticeable, and we haven't pulled together in the same way. So I think the agency is trying to take a leadership role. I personally think, this is a personal opinion, not an agency opinion, it's probably impractical to try and legislate this. I think that we were having a conversation last week, as you start to see these pieces roll out, if there's pushback on Capitol Hill, is it going to come from industry? Is it going to come from health systems? Or is there not going to be pushback? We don't know the answer to that. Yeah. So that's, I don't know if I addressed your question, but those are my thoughts.
And the other part of the I don't know if the guy from ONC, Office of National Coordinator, is still here. Are you still here, John? Okay, so he bragged justifiably about, before we had meaningful use requirements, X% of medical records were electronic. Now there's been a massive improvement. So why then are they off the hook? So why couldn't ONC think about ways to push data standardization in the same type of way?
Well, this is just my opinion. Yeah. I think they could, but I think our problem is, I think data standards is a part of the problem. It's not the entire problem. Are we committed as a community to making sure we have good, high-quality evidence? If we are, one of the things we need are data standards and better interoperability, but that's just a piece of the problem, and it's probably the most, not being a data person, easily solvable piece. So we could push, ONC could push harder or less hard, but we still we'll have all this interoperable data and we won't have answers.
Frida, so to maybe refine Steve's request that FDA require real-world evidence on every drug application, and maybe get a little bit more, maybe a little more focus on a practical step to get there, or other comments.
Yeah. So actually, I mean, we talk a lot about incentives, but incentives to do what? I mean, I think that the incentives that are for not standardizing data, may require one action, and incentives for companies to step up and do a test, if you would, with the FDA on the use of real-world data in a post-marketing trial, for example, or pre-approval would be a different alignment of incentives. What we would do in the care setting to have people aligned and put their data in so that it could be appropriately used for research. I think the incentives are different for different players at different times under different circumstances. So I think one of the ways to solve that becomes doing the use case, which is just to say, what would be the plan for developing a new medicine under these circumstances, using real-world data at these points that we think might be appropriate under these circumstances. Okay, now what's standing in the way of that?
Mm-hmm. But you do need to do that use case, I think, end to end, starting with data
Exactly.
availability, the standards, the study design methods, and on to the incentives, including regulatory
But
standards. that could pull
I
that
think
through.
what I'm suggesting is by doing that end to end, you can then say, wow, the incentives are really not aligned at this point with these players, and potentially there's a solution there. But I think standing back here and trying to figure out whether or not there's an incentive at the end that we should be doing that's legislative versus one, with the employees at the FDA, it doesn't play all the way through unless you have exactly the problem that you're solving. I think you said fit for purpose. So what is the solution there with the incentives there? And then you do that twice, 3 times, 5 times, and you've started to solve the system issue, I think.
So Rachel, and then John, and then Greg.
I mean, there's one place we're all failing miserably, which is labeling, which is one of our most powerful tools. And truthfully, well, we all share blame, but can you, so I don't work at a company, but I can imagine it would be a pretty powerful incentive if the company had confidence that certain data would be going into labeling. And if it's, for example, long-term safety data that informs use, I think that's going to help Greg decide whether he should use antipsychotic A versus antipsychotic B. That's a simple, tiny little use case. But again, as usual, I like the fact that you're putting it in biteable pieces, because what's going to incentivize me as a practicing physician to randomize is very different than what's going to incentivize your company to do something, or someone's health system.
John?
Yeah, so I guess one thing I would offer is that I think that in particular major disease areas, so for example maybe diabetes, that we have such documented problems with quality of outcomes of care, and that there is some role that for public-private partnerships that maybe the FDA and other governmental agencies could become involved in facilitating to bring all the stakeholders together in a pre-competitive way to talk, including the patients and the patient organizations, to really have frank discussions about this end-to-end infrastructure and what is really important and how to work together to do things in a way that isn't tied to the antiquated ways of doing things that have not worked. And just the tremendous presentations by John Carroll and Mike Mack about all of the collaboration that went on in developing the TVT registry. And it just strikes me that all of that happened despite the formal processes that were in place. It was the passionate, voluntary participation and bringing together of stakeholders by leaders from different parties who had no incentives to work together, who brought FDA and CMS and the specialty societies, everyone together to figure out a different way of doing things. But that's not scaling. Most of the people in this room probably had never heard of the TVT registry, and so it's one example, and I'd love to see that spread across the healthcare industry. And so if we can figure out a way to build on that, then that would be terrific.
Greg?
Your challenge about finding some sort of end-to-end solutions, where some victories, made me wonder. I don't know, is Michael Mack still here?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about this. So, what if we said we took this nice worked example of the TVT registry, where we already have these data and we're actually linking to CMS data for some purposes, and we said, could we link to CMS data and look at total costs of care? And could we do direct comparisons of total costs of care, either for alternative products or for transcatheter valve replacement versus surgical valve replacement? And we brought those data to FDA and we asked for labeling. You know, a manufacturer said, based on those data, I would like approval for a labeling that my product reduces total costs of care compared to. Could we get there?
So I would like Mike to answer that, and this is also our transition. It was a great way of framing it to comments, questions from all of you, particularly around what are the if not fully worked examples, at least foundations for end-to-end worked examples that could make this possible. Mike?
So I think the short answer is yes. The longer answer is what it takes to get there. I do think, as I mentioned, the data from the registry from off-label use has been used for label expansion already. I think that very definitely the cost-effectiveness data that can be generated from it can absolutely be used. So, you know, on one hand, yes, there are multiple uses that can be expanded from it, but as I mentioned, yeah, there's a lot of aspects that aren't scalable. Like, for example, you know, after we had this successful model, we got contacted by the Urology Society and the Plastic Surgery Society, and you know, for breast implants, it required 10-year follow-up. How do you do that? You know, without a single database, without a single payer, without it being CMS, et cetera. So a lot of the aspects, the answer is yes. As I was sitting here thinking about it, you know, there's an example, it was the PROTECT trial that was in the New England Journal 3 or 4 weeks ago about looking at surgery versus medical therapy versus radiation therapy for early stage prostate cancer. And if you just look at the data or the results of the trials at 10 years out, your higher chance of being disease-free is by surgery and radiation. And you've got a greater chance of having disease on observational therapy. But then in the accompanying patient-centered aspect of it is, oh, by the way, it's at the price of urinary incontinence and sexual impotence. Well, those are two outcomes that can easily be captured, you know, in Medicare population, et cetera, through a variety of things. So this was done in a randomized trial format, but that's something to me that's very easy to expand a patient-centered outcome to a real-world aspect of it. And based upon that evidence, I'm not having surgery for my prostate cancer. I don't want to wear a diaper and take Viagra.
I'm just curious, Rachel, the idea of TVT registry bringing you cost data from CMS to support labeling, what do you think?
I wish you'd gone someplace else besides cost. I wish cost. No, no. But anything that clinical, yeah.
But you know, I would say, I'll ask John Carroll to comment here because you know he's very thoughtful about all this. You know, one of the things we found out is FDA is safety and effectiveness. CMS for reimbursement is reasonable and necessary. And most payers follow Medicare guidelines on that. And one of the biggest obstacles to use right now, use CardioMEMS device, for example, is it's FDA approved, but nobody's paying for it. So if you can develop the cost-effective data and that spurs reimbursement, then that gets through the major barrier that we're having right now from that standpoint.
One thing that has been a real focus of Rob since he arrived a year ago is a closer connection between CMS and FDA. It's on the you know, sort of worker bee level, it's been always there, but not the leadership. And a company should be able, while they're doing their development plan, to speak to both the payer side and the regulatory side, and one would hope it would be one development plan.
Yeah, and one thing I would say, I mean, I would give kudos to both FDA and CMS on this. I've said this many times, and John, I think, agrees with this. The professional society's bureaucracy has had the ability to make the federal government look efficient. I mean, the obstacle is not FDA and CMS. The obstacle is us.
True, although I would say the silo between FDA and CMS has not gone away.
No.
And we need really major changes to make this process more efficient, because now it's a sequential process that's time-consuming, expensive, and we're not designing the original clinical trials in the way they'll meet CMS's need all the time. So we can see some improvements in Washington.
Well, wait, I think you didn't want John to get off just with that criticism of FDA CMS coordination. I think just to push this a little further, we certainly aren't there with this well-designed end-to-end approach yet, but you have some very direct, very relevant experience for what might be needed to get there. What would be what's your views? I think this is where Mike was going with bringing the mic over on where the next steps would be to get to more effective real-world evidence that would be useful for both FDA, CMS, and would have a stronger incentive case as a result.
One, I think, lesson learned from the TVT registry is the value of having all stakeholders at a table where you're designing a new system and executing in an efficient manner. Because if you don't have those people at the table, then you're always addressing things post hoc, et cetera. So I think that's one thing we've learned as in professional societies working through this multi-stakeholder process. And it includes having people like Z to define the patient outcomes that really matter, something that we had done a poor job previously.
Could I make one comment?
Yeah, John, and then Jesse.
Push back a little bit is I would observe that what happened with the TVT was kind of starting in the middle and working together to get things over the finish line and to handle things in the post-approval environment. And the challenge is still out there, or how to work together in a collaborative fashion end to end. And so that's why I made the comment that I made, is I'd like to see some type of formal processes created that people could come together from the very beginning. I can guarantee you that Edwards and Abbott and Medtronic never anticipated the outcomes that happened with TVT and so on from the very beginning. So is there a way that we can come together and get the input from FDA and CMS and everyone involved from the very beginning to get it right, instead of having everything being created halfway through or on the 1 yard line?
Yeah, Jesse next, and then I'll go to Nigam after that.
Yeah, just following up on the TVT, just to point out, to follow up on the discussion we had a little earlier about the amount of data that are being collected. One of the risks of having that many people at the table is everybody has an opinion about what you need to ask, and then you end up with a data collection process that's longer than the procedure. And we see that internally. The more stakeholders you bring, and if nobody's in charge, then that's a potential challenge.
Yes, although I think the counter-argument is that if you're collecting data for multiple uses, local quality control, regulatory purposes, to efficiency of hospital care, if that's different. You do need additional data elements. And while we've learned we overdid it, and that can, I think, as John says, going forward, we can do a much more efficient job of that. We were kind of in a discovery phase, and the last thing we wanted to do is not collect something that we then subsequently found was key for a risk model, adjusted outcomes, et cetera.
Yeah, just in response, since Mike, you mentioned the breast implant registry, which is still kind of plodding along through negotiations. We're part of that discussion. The model, last I heard, the model there was good, and it's admittedly a very different situation, so I don't mean to draw a direct parallel, but for that purpose, there's no reimbursement, there's no payer. That these 10-year follow-up studies have very low retention because they were asking for 40 pages worth of data every 6 months, and that's just nuts. These women have no incentive to provide that information that frequently. So the model has gone almost to the other extreme of saying, let's make a list. We'll collect the basic information about the surgery and the device, the implant, whatever detail we need at entry to the registry, and you only get back into the registry if you were reoperated, which is really the major potential safety issue. But then, since you have a list now, if you have other questions, and if you can link to claims or EMR data or both, then you have the possibility to embed other studies into the registry, which is a much more efficient way of doing it than starting from scratch.
So I'm usually very nervous when registries get mentioned because they require care and feed. 476 FTEs to populate data on 75,000 people. That's a lot of dollars. I mean, if you calculate it per data field, so 75 of those data fields were actually used on these 75,000 people in publications over whatever many years, maybe a decade. So 476 FTEs for 10 years. I mean, we're talking millions of dollars, $200,000, $300,000 per data item. Not sustainable. I mean, we can't do this for 4,095 approved drugs.
Push on what's the, so in terms of next steps for in, what's the way to bring that cost down while still accomplishing the same goals as TVT has been critical in achieving?
So, but if we keep using a registry as an exemplar, that implies outside of health system data collection.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say if we go that,
but you're going to have to pull data together across multiple health systems. The question is, what's the most efficient way to do it?
I'm an academic. I can give you the method for that. I can't solve the incentives for that.
Each one uses 0.8 an FTE.
I wanted to flag this concern because as a recommendation, if we say that this kind of data collection is a solution, we're going to increase the cost by 10x.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so I would observe that, first of all, I think all of the data that's been collected is mandated essentially by CMS, and that it's determined by the professional societies to be medically necessary to collect in clinical practice. And yet, the big problem and the requirement for the FDEs is because of the data interoperability and the need to enter the data into your regular, OR database and then to send it down to the basement and someone abstracts it out of there, puts it into the TVT registry case report form, all based on data that's already
not that open API
EHR.
automatic interoperability for data that you were talking
Exactly.
about.
So if there were a smart on fire type of interface that you could just input it once, it would feed the EHR, it would feed the registry, and you're done. There's no need for any FTEs.
So in respond to that, Frida, and then I do want to go back to the rest of you here. Maybe Mike can continue roving. You're doing a good job with the roving mic, but I do want to go back for a few more comments if we have time from out here. But go ahead and respond, and then Frida, and then back to the participants.
So we've been looking at one of the hip joint and knee replacement registries at Stanford. And it turns out that a lot of the fields that are quote-unquote mandated can be filled out by natural language processing. So we can reduce the cost down by 15x. You lose about 5 to 8% accuracy. And so we can quantify that you can either have your FTE and you get this much accuracy, or you don't have your FTE and you have a piece of software populating about 80% of the fields at 95% accuracy. And it's really cheap. The acceptance of that is still up for debate. Now, Smart on Fire kept being brought up a couple of times. It doesn't handle free text. So then you can't do this using existing APIs because it will not transmit textual documents, which is where your information is.
Frida, and then I want to go back to...
So, and I just want to remind us, I think that registries are just a marvelous solution for the fact that we don't have a holistic data collection system that really works in the healthcare system. So, and Rob made the comment earlier today, the registries in rare disease are exemplary and they are just absolutely marvelous, but you can't proliferate them to cover 6,000 or 7,000 rare diseases. So now what? So this is what we're dealing with now. So, we have this registry, and now we're going to have, you know, hip and knee, and then back, and then, you know, we'll just go off the cliff. So the question is there some way to take the learnings from the registry, you know, tied together with technology, to give us a solution in the healthcare system that creates this learning one? If we were doing the wand thing, I had, so the earlier wish I had was a Harry Potter wand type wish. But if I had a Thor, more like a hammer than a wand type wish, I would have wished for kind of a fully digitized healthcare record platform that was interactive, that was efficient and not burdensome, and, you know, utilized all the technology to provide first data back to patients so that they could use it to improve their own health, to providers so that they could help make decisions, to systems so that they could improve their quality, and to the research community so that we could answer important questions and continue to improve the system. But we are still, I think we have everything we need for that, but we're still far away from producing it.
Yeah, but like if you start with, you know, sort of John's point about, you know, open APIs where you can, and Needham's point about trying out and validating more fit for purpose you know, natural language processing applications, and in a good use case, I think you could get there. Other questions or comments? All right. Well, we may have. So, have we solved the problem? I don't know. I don't know about that. But any other questions or thoughts from the group? Please go ahead. And
yeah, my name is John Birch. I'm the angel investor in the group, and I just want to emphasize data strategy and data and methods that I want to just suggest that. I think that's been kind of overlooked today in the conversation. I was at an HL7 conference just yesterday on fire, and it's easy to, because so much progress has been made, it's easy to overlook the data complexities of healthcare and the need for metadata. And in my view, one of the most important developments going on these days is the BDDK project at the National Institute of Health. And I just don't think we're going to ever come close to providing the quality and consistency and scale of data that real-world evidence in pharma and FDA type of applications calls for, until we have wrestled to the ground a lot of the data complexities. And that has to be done not with medicine as a whole. I think, to be honest, that's where Google Health failed years ago, among others. I realize, John, you were not part of that, but I'm often asked, by the way, why did Google Health fail? Because I mentor a lot of digital health entrepreneurs, and they say, well, you know, the question comes up, well, if Google couldn't do it, why can you make us believe that you can do it? And I don't know the answers to, because I wasn't there either. But in any event, the complexity is huge, and it varies from specialty to specialty. There's, 180 different medical specialties. My view, my understanding at this point, is that virtually every professional society has some sort of a committee that wants to make a positive contribution to the electronic medical support that specialty has. And there are very different data spheres, so to speak, within each one of those. So in terms of cognitive automation, which I mentioned before, it has to be done on a specialty by specialty basis. So there's still massive complexities yet ahead that we're going to have to deal with. I'll just make a final pitch for patient centricity. As long as we are dealing with provider-centric resources of data, we're never going to even come close to dealing with the right problems. In terms of the data complexity, it has to be looked at on a patient-centric basis.
And looking ahead, that's not where we're going to be in terms of care delivery or payment down the road. So, very good points. Thank you, John. Any other final questions or comments? Or let me turn back to the panel. Any last reflections or thoughts before we close? Rachel?
So intravenous ganciclovir was approved based on a case series. It had been this was before treatment INDs were standardized. There was a case series. People didn't go blind, and somehow we found a way to approve that. That was in the 80s.
There's a lot of environmental pressure at that.
But there was, well, environmental pressure, and people weren't going blind, and that's a pretty hard endpoint, and we didn't need 65 other fields. I'm not saying that's always true, but sometimes we collect a little more information than we need, and sometimes we find a way to get through when we weren't expecting it.
Oh, great point. Let me turn to, well, let me first say thank you to our panel for pulling together a lot of the ideas from today and trying to get as practical as possible in terms of next steps. Thank you all very much. And Steve and Greg, I'm sure there are lots of other people besides all of the participants here today that also need to be thanked, and other final thoughts.
I wanted to really thank all of you for your focus and devotion, and two groups deserve special thanks. First is the Academy's staff. Thank you very, very much. They're here, they're in the other room, and then our planning committee, who worked over several months quite intensely to put this together. Thanks a lot.
So we've come to the end of the opera. Some of us are still living. Valhalla has not burned. I hope you learned a few things along the way. Thanks very much.